Okay, so I think we should start with our first plenary session, which was supposed to be the second one, but so I would like to welcome you on this plenary session. It is the first time we will present results as a team. There were some presentations we did on different conferences from chosen aspects of our research. But we have so far never presented, I think, results of our analysis of in-depth interviews. We did national conference last year about quantitative part. It's a kind of challenge for us to speak to you today. Before also we start, I just want to present you my team. It's Dębska. She's the researcher. She cooperated first with us, and now she's kind of less fluid part of our team. Aleksander Radoszewski. He is with me from the very beginning. We cooperated from the idea I had, and he helped me with some financial issues of this project. Agata Stasińska, she was also with me she has been with me from the very beginning, helping with ideas that how to put them together, and she is researcher. She was also a coordinator of ethnographic part. And Joanna Zamorska, she was an ethnographer in the ethnographic part, and now she was responsible for focus group interviews coordination. And there were many people who work with us with this project. I say this because there are usually the questions, how many of you are, work together. We will talk about it later, but there were some coordinators of different stages of this research, of course, so there are not only us, but as a team right now, it's us working together. Okay, so let me begin. The presentation we prepared for you today is based on our ongoing research project on families of choice in Poland, which is a 3-year multi-method research concentrated on the daily life of non-heterosexual families. It started in 2013, and I'm its principal investigator. Before we present you with some chosen findings, we would like to tell you more about the whole project, which is the first such complex study conducted in Poland so far. First, about the idea and the name. We are fully aware of the fact that there is an ongoing discussion about the usefulness of the term family within queer theory and feminism, because the term family is so mythologized and overloaded with heteronormative assumptions. However, in the project, we have opted for retaining the concept, and we claim its political importance in given Polish circumstances. In our understanding of family and kinship, we are in favor in denaturalizing both concepts. They are perceived rather as practice, process, and choice than permanent, natural, and authentic phenomena. Our aim is to show the variety of family and intimate arrangements of non-heterosexual persons in Poland, and to understand the challenge they face in everyday life. We focus on personal narratives in order to present the family life of non-heterosexual people from their own perspective. And there are 4 particular areas of our research. First, family arrangements. So how do they create the relationships? What model of relationships are prevalent? And in which way does gender influence the actual model? Second, how do they display, conceptualize, and justify the relationships in their social surroundings? And what is the discourse concerning the issue of families of choice in Poland? Third, what are the needs and expectations of people living within families of choice towards the issue of the recognition and legal status in Poland? And fourth, parenthood and child well-being. How do they cope with their parenthood? How do they become parents? What is the role of the child, and how does it change the relation dynamic? The key to this project is its innovative and complex methodology. It is a mix of many different methods, both qualitative and quantitative. The research is carried out in different ways and it is divided into 7 tasks, all of which we have already completed. Here you have all of them in chronological order. It is important to underline that results of each level of research were used to develop a wider framework for the following stages. And now I will tell you more about each of the research stage. Here you can see all tasks that we accomplished during the first year of the research. At the beginning of the project, 2 months desk research was carried out aimed at collecting any available statistical and official data on people living in non-heterosexual families, familiar configurations. The scarcity or even lack of the official data concerning this issue in Poland resulted in difficulties in obtaining of information. Therefore, it was necessary to investigate various estimations presented by different NGOs at both the local and central level. Then a critical discourse analysis concerning mainstream as well as more marginal discourses of families of choice in Poland was conducted. Particular attention was paid to reconstructing the voices of the most important social actors shaping those discourses, such as state institutions, the Catholic Church, of course, academia, the third sector. And the analysis drew information from different sources, and you have them listed here. It covered the period of 10 years, so from 2003 to 2013. And interpretations of those materials took into account the institutional context of the production and reception, intertextual relations, and transformation between different texts, concepts, rhetoric, topic, showing their mutual interdependence. During critical discourse analysis, a set of selected case studies were chosen to be investigated more closely. Key public debates that concern the situation of non-heterosexual people in Poland, so the discussion around the first project on same-sex civil partnership law, discussed in the Polish Parliament in 2003, and the recent projects that were introduced in Polish Parliament in 2013, and both, like all of them, were discussed but not accepted. Legal cases, such as Polish case in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and state courts widely discussed in media and public discourses in Poland and abroad. These cases showed the discrepancy between legislation in the most of the EU member states and Poland, in such matters as inheritance or access to welfare services, as well as between the needs and expectations of non-heterosexual families and legislation provided by Polish juridical system. Task 4. Also during the first year, the quantitative survey was carried out on a large sample of respondents, 3,038 being in relationships and 2,378 singles. Throughout Poland, by use of questionnaire with closed and open responses. Because we dealt with a social group that is very difficult to access, no representative sample was possible. That's why we used modified version of snowball and respondent-driven sampling methods. The collection of data was divided into 2 parts. The first one was carried out by posters and the second via the internet. And there was at least 1 poster in every province in Poland. Altogether, 37 posters worked for us. In the second part, information about the study was distributed via the internet, mostly portals addressed to non-heterosexual persons and also Facebook. At this stage, we also collected data from single non-heterosexual persons for comparative purposes. Task 53 in-depth interviews were performed in the second year of the project by use of the biographical method. It aimed at the question of individual performance in the relationships. It also attempted to draw upon the dynamic changes of the relationships in time and the role of such key decisions as establishing a common household, deciding to live apart, leaving the relationship open, parenting and raising a child. Task 6. In the second half of the second year of the research, ethnographic research was carried out. The ethnographic model took place in all regions of Poland in 21 families of different composition for the period of 1 month. And in a moment, Agata Stasińska will present you the concept of this part of the research in more detail. Because as far as we know, there have been no similar studies so far with such an innovative and complicated methodological approach. And task 7, in the third year, this year we just finished this part, 22 focus group interviews were conducted. We have just finished this last month. And the respondents of this part were recruited from different generations and localization and from diverse social and economic backgrounds, and were invited to the FGIs on the basis of their role, status in family, with simultaneous gender diversification. Altogether, 153 people took part. Interviews took part in 3 different locations, so north, middle, and south of Poland. And we had 4 moderators working with us during this part. And we did 5 focus group interviews with biological mothers, both from plant and step families, 4 with co-mothers from plant and step families. Only, unfortunately, 1 focus groups with gay fathers, 4 focus groups with children brought up in non-heterosexual in relationships from different age groups, so 6 to 9, 10 to 13, 14 till 16, and adults. 3 with siblings of non-heterosexual persons, 3 with parents of non-heterosexual persons who are in same-sex relationships, and 2 with men and women above 55 who are in same-sex relationships. And we can already say that in our case, the focus group could be seen as a place of action itself, and that gave participants additional benefits, namely the ability to get contacts with other people in a similar situation and therefore create networks and support groups. So it was a very important aspect of our, I think, the whole research, but focus groups was something special in this terms. And now I will give floor to Agata Stasińska, who was the coordinator of ethnographic part, and tell you more about our challenging experience during this stage of research.
Okay, yeah. Last year we carried out the ethnographic research that we believe is worth telling you more about today. The choice of the ethnographic method was motivated by the fact that this is the most suitable method of collecting data about behavior and interaction strategies of people in their daily natural environment. Ethnographic research of family relations has a long tradition in social sciences, being the method that allows the depth and breadth of insight, which is impossible to gain through the usage of other methods of data gathering. In our research, we did very intensive monthly ethnography with each family, since we wanted to overcome the observer effect that is always present, basically, in ethnographic studies. So we conducted this research with 21 families from different regions in Poland, and it's kind of important to underline that the study is the longest and the most intensive research conducted in the area of queer familial life, as far as we know, basically. Our research goals were to explore practices of doing families in day-to-day life, meaning building home, caring for the household; intimacy, meaning displaying affection, strategies of communication and problem solving; doing families in social networks, an example, relations with families of origin and friends; parenthood, meaning parental day-to-day strategies and challenges; and living in certain local contexts of legal and social non-recognition. That's the tricky part. And now I'll tell you more about the research process. We recruited respondents from the sample gathered in the quantitative survey, because we could use it for this purpose. When recruiting for this part of the research, we were afraid that it would be very hard to find respondents willing to participate in such a demanding study. And we were surprised to see how many people responded to our ad. We chose 21 out of 32 families who declared the will to participate in the research, and the families were as diverse as possible, considering such variables as gender, age, economic status, heritage, social and cultural background, length of the partnership, and number of children. 6 families raising children took part in the research. 1 even had 4 children, so it was crazy. Families had the opportunity to carefully discuss details of the project with the coordinator and ethnographers. They signed a written agreement to participate in the research, and in some cases they met with the coordinator and the ethnographer before the research began to talk about the research process. Every family could withdraw from the research at any point. They also received financial gratification for their participation in the research. Ethnographers were carefully recruited from MA and PhD students of anthropology and social sciences from different cities. Ethnographers took part in a training that consisted of weekly trial usage of an online journal that they had to fulfill later, and 2 days training prepared by the research team. Their knowledge and expertise was crucial for the success of the whole research, as they were our eyes and the ears in the field. We believe that it was mainly thanks to them, their sensitivity and established warm contacts with families, that none of the families withdrew from the research. And every ethnography has a supervisor, but was supervised by one of the members of the research team. In some cases, the supervisor knew the family from previous stages of the research, and our role as supervisor was to support the ethnographer in the field and help him in substantive issues considering observation and analysis. Each of us had 5 families' ethnographies under supervision. Lastly, the whole research had a coordinator. I was responsible for keeping the whole process going. I checked if ethnographers wrote the daily journal entries and performed the research tasks within the prescribed deadlines. I served as the primary contact for the families and ethnographers if they had any problems getting along. The ethnography was a collaborative one, as you can see, which meant that the whole team, families, ethnographers, coordinator, and supervisor had to develop the same standards and understand the principles, goals, and methods in the same manner to effectively and reliably lead the whole process so that the gathered research material could be compared in the analysis. Besides writing a journal based on daily observation, ethnographers had to conduct several research tasks. The schedule of the task was precisely planned and with small modification in time depending on the families, their will, their agenda, was realized this way. During the first evening spent with the family, the ethnographer and the family had to establish some ground rules of cohabitation and cooperation. They differed in every family, but the most important goal here was to establish an open and honest communication and cooperation. We encourage our researchers to write down those rules that they established with the family and place them somewhere visible in the household. The biographical interviews with the couple also took place during the first week. This was the first extended narrative the family told and the point of reference for future exploration of all the fields of the research, basically. Usually, this interview was also a very important step in developing close and warm contact between the researcher and the family. In the second week, researchers performed interview on significant pictures and objects that the couple had chosen. The interviews brought up important memories and facilitated telling stories and talking about specific events in the life of the informants. In the third week, the interview around family maps took place. The partners were interviewed separately this time. This part of the research involved usage of the method proposed by Irene Levin, who draws attention to the importance of the way that the individual understands and defines the notion of the family. And usually, during the last week, the ethnographer performed an interview about important places connected with taking a tour with a family. This interview enabled us to see the family in a certain space and see how they feel about the place they live in. We were able to diagnose safe spaces, places of romantic memories, places that are significant for their daily activities. In the end, ethnographers performed final interviews separately with both members of the couple. The final interviews were devoted to the subjects that were diagnosed as difficult or still missing from the previous conversations and observation of the family. Questions for this interview were chosen together by the ethnographer and the supervisor. By interviewing the couple together and separately, we gained a more holistic and complex portrayal of their accounts. As I already mentioned, the ethnographers wrote a journal using a specific platform designed by the research team. That's the screenshot you may see on the slide. Every day till 2 p.m., the ethnographer posted a new journal entry describing the previous day of the life of the family. Every entry was daily read and commented by the supervisor, so the ethnographer and the supervisor were in constant dialogue regarding the daily life of the family. For longer discussion between the ethnographers and the supervisor, there was also a chat option in the journal. There were also many other options of the journal, just for doing it right way. The ethical dimension of this challenging research was very important to us. During the whole process, we did everything we could to guarantee the anonymity and confidentiality of our respondents. We established an ethical code that was the guideline for all parties that took part in the research. Our primary goal was to care about the families and their welfare. Of course, we encountered many ethical dilemmas during the ethnography. Some problems concerned the confidentiality and sharing information. During the monthly ethnography, it was very hard for the participants, ethnographers, and the family to maintain a strictly professional relationship. Families shared secrets with the ethnographers that they didn't want to be included in the framework of the research, and we decided to enable them to withhold any information that they feel they want to do. Some families were really curious about the ethnographer journal. Some were also curious what ethnographers thought about them. We decided that while we'll definitely share the final results of the research with them, we cannot enable them access to the journal nor to the ethnographer's individual reports. Ethnographers were also advised not to diagnose the family during the research. Participation in the research sometimes revealed problems that families struggled with. Ethnographers witnessed highly difficult and emotional moments that were caused by the research itself. In example, very intimate interviews that revealed problems and conflicts that the couple had. Ethnographers also witnessed difficult moments in the life of the family. An example, divorce case with former partner and parent of the child, death of the family member, crisis within the relationship, or assault of one of the participants. How much to engage in the life of the families was then an ethical dilemma for them and for us as supporting party. And finally, it was also ethically challenging for us as supervisors who read the ethnographer's journal every day and this way participated in someone else's life. In some moments, even 2 or 3 lives simultaneously, because it just was in the same time. We read about the families and tried to understand their reality without actually participating in their lives. We felt very privileged that we are gaining exceptional knowledge, but still we also feel and we still feel very accountable to the families and the data. Unfortunately, we don't have results yet because it's so big. So. And our analytical work has started, but it's planned till autumn since the large range of material that you can see on the slide. Ethnographers' reports serve us as a key reference point for our analysis since the insight that the ethnographers provided cannot be underestimated. But that's not the end of the presentation. So we did evaluation process of the whole research. After the fieldwork that took like 4 months to do, we decided to do this evaluation. We contacted all the families and ethnographers to ask them to evaluate the experience of the research using online questionnaire so that we could gather an anonymous feedback from both sides. We asked what was the most interesting, surprising, difficult thing for them during the research. We also asked them to give their opinions on interviews they participated in. Almost every family and ethnographer decided to share their opinions with us. We organized an evaluation meeting for the team of ethnographers where the results of the questionnaire were discussed. And in this final part of part of the presentation we are giving today, I will talk briefly about the results of our evaluation, but now I will give the voice to Joanna Zamorska, who was one of the ethnographers, so she may share her unique experience with you.
All the ethnographers were satisfied with their work, and most of them were rather satisfied. They emphasized how interesting the daily observation of the dynamics of the same-sex relationship was. They also claimed it influenced their worldview, the perception of their own relationships, as well as the internalized hidden images of the family and non-heteronormativity. The most difficult for all ethnographers was that they were emotionally and physically tired of that strong engagement after some time. Some of them experienced difficulty in separating leisure and work time and could not reset the mind. It was also connected with the activity schedule, which included different and time-consuming methods, apart from participant observation and the regime of diary writing. They also considered it difficult to represent their experience well in diaries and reports and to make it understandable for the research team and not to harm the research participants. I conducted ethnographic research in a childless gay family and same-sex female family with an adolescent son. One of the partners doesn't consider herself as a lesbian nor bisexual. They were in their 30s, except for one of the gay partners, both living in smaller cities that are close to the bigger ones. First was a middle-class family, and second was a working-class family. The working-class family almost didn't have time together due to shift work. In contrast to the gay family who ate together daily, baked bread and prepared freshly ground coffee. While comparing my experiences during the fieldwork, I discovered that although I shared the same gender with the women family, the class membership was more important in my finding of comfort and similar values during both ethnographies. I discovered that my values, preferences in leisure or food were very often challenged and questioned in the working class family, and that I felt much more at home in the gay couple's family. Just to give you some examples, in the working class family, we ate vegetables that I would probably have disposed of at my home because they were out of date, some of them, not all of course. Also, when I prepared the dish of steaming leek with potatoes, family didn't try it. They considered it to be inedible because it was so different from the diet. I also found it difficult to not get involved in conflicts in the research field. In the same-sex female family, I was expected to be a trustee for Kinga while at the same time being allied with Manuela against Kinga's mother, who was living in poor health and economic conditions. Manuela expressed a disgust for her attitude to health. Kinga's mother didn't have access to running water nor toilet in her apartment. I tried to maintain the distance for the sake of the research, but it was just a role I played. Inside of me, I felt I was a trustee of Kinga. I didn't share the disgust for her mother with Manuela. I ate Kinga's mother's food, which disappointed her daughter-in-law, Manuela. I explained to her that it is a rule in the research that I have to take care not to offend people I do research with. Actually, that was consistent with my feelings, and the research was a good excuse. Kinga almost... one of the most problematic visual methods used in the field was a family map. Kinga almost quit the research because of this method. Manuela's adult son, Darek, didn't draw his social mother, Kinga, on his map and told her about it. So she said that she didn't fit to the research of family of choice because she wasn't considered as a family member. After a long discussion, she decided to continue participating in the ethnography. I felt guilty because I wasn't aware of the risk, and I didn't ask them not to talk about it after drawing the map. In case of Patrick and Claudius, they were focused on Patrick's healing process, so I didn't have the opportunity to observe any serious conflicts between them. But doing the cartography of their favorite places was difficult because Patrick almost couldn't walk due to his chronic disease. I felt guilty for talking about this planned activity, knowing the fact that it could be impossible for him to accomplish. The method reminded the young man that he couldn't do everything he wanted. It made me sad because I didn't want him to feel different, uncomfortable with in the research. I give my voice back to Agata.
And now I'll tell you more about the feedback from the families. Most of the families were satisfied that they took part in the research. The most interesting thing for them was the insight into the relationship they gained during the research and the satisfaction connected with building a connection to an ethnographer who was once a stranger and became someone close and important during the whole month. The most difficult for the families was the constant presence of the ethnographer and the engagement necessary for taking part in the weekly interview, as well as the emotional challenge that they were for them. From our preliminary analysis of the material, we can see several reasons and consequences of participating in the research that the families mentioned mostly in the interviews. The research had different meanings for every couple, but some meanings were mentioned especially often. For those struggling with self-acceptance, taking part in the research was a way to build self-esteem and self-acceptance as a LGBT person. For many couples, taking part in the research was also an act of activism. They felt that our research has a potential to change reality, and that knowledge production may be an important factor in changing the mentality of the society and policymakers. For some, taking part in the research was an empowerment trigger. It made them feel like a member of the LGBT community, and that they started to be more active in the local community by taking part in events such as parades or LGBT meetings. And last but not least, for some couples, taking part in the research had a therapeutic meaning. For some of them mentioned the experience helped them to realize problems that they have in the relationships. Some mentioned that they help solving them. We believe that all those reasons are very important, and we are very happy that many participants gained so much from this experience, basically. To conclude, although we haven't analyzed the research material yet, we already know that choosing a multi-method approach within the ethnographic study enabled us to developing multifaceted material and deep description of the family, creating a space of dialogue, polyphony of perspectives, and negotiation of meanings between the researchers and informants, and observing discrepancies between the sphere of declaration and the sphere of practice, and how those spheres intervene and influence one another. By conducting a very intensive research, we were able to see how the relations within the family evolve in time, and how certain features of the family life, for example conflicts, division of chores, needs that were initially hidden from the ethnographers, are rooted in the developed strategies of matching individual needs, personalities, and realities of material life. Choosing this paradigm and creating the research in the way we described enable us to develop a deep intersectional analysis that will allow us to understand initially hidden interdependence of many structural factors like class, locality, social origin, or gender, mainstream discourse, etc. And take into account factors that sometimes create problems in aspects of familial life that are taken for granted. The ethnographic research that I have briefly described was in many ways a challenge for us as designers of its methodology, supervisors doing the research, and supporters of the needs and expectations of both families and ethnographers. We faced ethical and methodological dilemmas many times. The research was a lesson for us on many levels. We learned a lot about how the context of the research can modify the methodological and theoretical approaches, and about collective ethnography. But most of all, we learned about the twists and turns of the daily life of non-heterosexual families. It opened our eyes to the deeper understanding of what it means to live livable lives as families of choice in a reality that is often very hostile. And now I will give the voice back to Joanna and Mizielinska, and you will start another part.
So we are going to results now. Don't worry, we will present some.
Don't worry.
So today we will, of course, present only a small part of chosen results from our analysis of in-depth interviews. But in doing so, we will also refer to some findings from our quantitative survey, and you received all of you received the report. That corresponds to themes that we will be discuss. That's why now I would like to present you some basic information about our respondents, first from the quantitative survey and then from the IDI part. So, the final analysis, which has been included in the report, was conducted on 3,038 persons. All respondents were in relationship with same-sex partners for minimum 6 months, average 4 years, and maximum 42 years. Most of the respondents lived together in a single household. The majority of the rest wanted to live together in the future. 9% of people had children, so data concerning 287 children being raised by non-heterosexual persons were collected. Half of the children were below 13 years old. Here you can see basic information about our sample. It is important to notice that our respondents were quite young, with higher education than average Poles. They were also less religious than average Pole and preferred to live in big cities for obvious reasons, because it allowed them to escape homophobia more presented in smaller ones. And now basic information about IDI interviewees. They were chosen from our quantitative data respondents. Some people, like transgender people, were recruited separately, and although we have tried our best, we conducted only 3 interviews with transgender persons. And we can discuss later why it was so. Altogether, we conducted 53 interviews. Again, we can see that the majority of our interviewees had higher education and lived in towns above 30,000 inhabitants, and the majority were above 30 years old. And here you can see the whole spectrum of the ages of our interviewees. The small number of the youngest generation was mostly due to the criterion of the research, namely that they had to be in relationships that lasted at least 1 year. And although this criterion was being in relationship lasting a minimum 1 year, the majority had relationships longer than 5 years. Almost 25% had non-monogamous relationships, but they were like mostly men, 11 men and 2 women, 75% monogamous. 28% of our interviewees had children. The majority of interviews were conducted in Poland, but we also decided to talk to recent migrants. So we did interviews with 3 lesbian couples with children and 1 gay couple, and both partners were interviewed but separately. So altogether, we did 33 interviews conducted with only 1 person from the couple, 20 interviews with 2 persons from the couple, so we have perspectives, 33 interviews where we have only 1 partner's perspective of the relationships, and 10 cases where both partners present, tell their story, but were interviewed separately. And now about a short comment about stages of data analysis. The first part of the analysis was, of course, coding, and we used Max-CUDA data management to accomplish this task. The outcome of the second part of the analysis was a biographical portrait of the couple that focused on the trajectory of the relationship and the description of the main aspect of family life. And every researcher coded the interviews that he conducted, and had at least 1 interview with 2 partners of the same couple to code. He also wrote a biographical portrait of that family because he had the best knowledge to do so. Then the third stage of analysis started, which was an in-depth analysis of chosen areas of relational lives. Every researcher had at least 1 of the research areas that were assigned to him, her, because of his interest. And he based the analysis on all 53 interviews. Although the main aim of the project was the description of experiences that evokes from the data, most of the researchers used the analytical induction approach that combines rules of grounded theory, so the theory that evokes from the data, like staying close to the material, with analysis that refers to some preconceptions and research questions, so testing theory in relation to the data. And here queer theory and methodology was the most inspiring background, but not only. In terms of analytical tools, we used mostly content analysis, but also semantic analysis and elements of critical discourse analysis and case studies. As a result, 8 research area reports were written concerning different, and each of them had like 100 pages, so they were huge. Were written concerning different aspects of familial lives. And now we would like to show you the most interesting findings of 4 of them, referring simultaneously to adequate findings from the quantitative survey. For the purpose of this presentation, we have chosen the following marked in color topics. So Kasia will tell you about legal recognition of, or maybe lack of recognition of same-sex families in Poland. Aleksander about identity. Agata about intimate life, and at the end I will tell you more about definitions of family and relationships with families of origins and friends. So now I give floor to Kasia.
Thank you very much. I was responsible for preparing two reports. The first one about the organization of daily life of families of choice in Poland. The second one about their legal situation. As you heard, I will present you the most important findings of the latter. Non-heterosexual couples are discriminated against by Polish law as they do not have the right to choose whether they want to get married, and in consequence to gain the rights and duties assigned to a wife and a husband by the law. Under Polish law, there are no regulations concerning same-sex relationships and families they create. Naturally, the law applies to them, but they are viewed by the law as strangers to each other. Since 2003, 7 civil partnerships bills have been prepared in Poland. None of them were adopted. A couple of weeks ago, just a few days after the presidential election won by the candidate of the right-wing party, Land Justice, the Polish parliament, with the majority of center-right-wing party Civic Platform, decided not to proceed with the most current civil partnerships bill. What should be highlighted here is the fact that the most controversial issue during all the debates concerning the possibility of institutionalization of same-sex relationships has been the adoption of children. As the results of the quantitative part of our project show, over 75% of the respondents declared that they would like to formalize their relationship. This result shows that the lack of legal recognition of families of choice prevents Polish non-heterosexual citizens from fulfilling their needs as regards formalization of the relations they create. Our survey shows, as you can see from the chart, that the pragmatic reasons behind the will to formalize relationships exceed the importance of symbolic or romantic reasons, which still are important for the majority of our respondents. As you can see, over 70% of respondents would like to formalize their relationship in order to cause the recognition of them by the family and social environment. The lack of legal recognition of same-sex relationships results in many problems, which are listed on the present chart. What seems to be important in the context of this chart is the conclusion drawn from our analysis that not only the experience of discrimination, but also the possibility of becoming the victims of discrimination influences the lives of our respondents in multiple ways. For example, our respondents sometimes restrain themselves from making their relationships visible in public out of the fear of discrimination. Deep analysis of interviews allowed us to differentiate strategies of safeguarding the members of the families developed by our respondents. By this, they exhibit lots of creativity and self-agency. One of these strategies is making wills in favor of their partner and of children, if they are not one's biological children. This form of inheritance, will inheritance, is not as safe as the inheritance according to the intestacy law. Under Polish law, there is the institution of legitim, which means that even if somebody prepares their last will, some of their relatives, as defined by the intestacy law, are still entitled to a part of the legacy. When we take into consideration the fact that many LGBTQ people and their relationships are not accepted by their families of origin, we should understand why a written will as a form of bequeathing does not seem sufficiently safe. Furthermore, same-sex partners often prepare written authorizations for each other in order to facilitate their daily life as a couple. Without such documents, same-sex partners are not legally able to deal with any official issues of their partner. Joint ownership of properties is thought by some of our respondents as the most safe and at the same time as the most accessible way of safeguarding the rights of partners for the future. Many of our respondents try to indicate the existence of their family in official contexts. One of the forms of making the relationship visible in public is the change of the family name of one partner to that of the other. Actually, this does not alter the legal character of the bond between the same-sex partners, but it may be useful in many situations in which it is necessary to prove the existence of a bond between the partners in order to deal with issues connected with one of them. For example, when the partner is in hospital and doctors are authorized to provide information only to the relatives of the ill person, or people expressly authorized by the ill person, about his or her health. This may be viewed as a form of circumventing the law. However, it should be rather treated as a way of dealing with a discriminatory law. Under Polish law, the situation of social parents is particularly difficult. Biological parents and their children have both rights and duties towards one another, which safeguards both sides of the relation. However, the law does not recognize the relation between a social parent and a biological child or children of his or her partner. Consequently, there is no legal bond between social parents and children. The charts presented on the slide prove that the level of engagement of social mothers in the process of children upbringing is significant, and as such should not be ignored by public institutions and law. As the quantitative report shows, in families of our respondents, the persons looking after the children do the majority of the activities together, especially taking walks, providing entertainment, playing with, and babysitting. Contact with teachers in kindergarten or school was an exception. This duty always fell on one person, the biological parent. It was the same in case of any issues connected with the health of the child, and the biological parent was also more involved in issues connected with this sphere. These two spheres were the most often dealt with by the biological parent, probably because of their ability to legally represent the child in contact with educational or healthcare institutions, as well as because of the difficulties involved in revealing the character of the family in contact with such institutions. Generally speaking, biological and social mothers declared a similar level of financial involvement in the support of the child, although the costs paid by the biological mothers were a little higher. A significant difference was noticeable only in two groups of expenses: school utensils and additional activities. Social mothers, to a great extent and voluntarily, supported the child financially, although they have no parental rights. One of the most important conclusions from our analysis is the fact that families of choice experience a lot of anxiety as far as issues connected with the legal aspect of relations between children and social parents are concerned. Some parents try to demonstrate in official situations, for example during contacts with officials, teachers, workers of nurseries, as in the case of Dorota, who is quoted on the slide, that both parents, biological and social, take responsibility for their children, take care of them, and engage themselves in the process of bringing them up. Biological parents also often authorize social parents for making decisions concerning the child. Another strategy of safeguarding rights and duties of social parents and children is making arrangements with the family of origin concerning childcare in the case of illness or death of the biological parent. The possible discrimination which can result, for example, in depriving homosexual parents of parental rights may also influence the strategies of reproduction of same-sex couples. Such an explanation is used by Lucyna, as we can see on the slide. To sum up, lack of legal recognition of families of choice results in numerous problems non-heterosexual people and their relatives have to deal with. As I tried to show during my presentation, non-heterosexual people in Poland have to safeguard their rights by themselves, while heterosexual people may enjoy such facilitations just by getting married. The situation turns out even more complicated when a same-sex couple brings up children. The analysis of the data gathered during our project proves that LGBTQ people do create families, which should be protected by Polish law to the same extent that heterosexual families are. All families deserve protection under the Article 18 of the Polish Constitution, which states that marriage, being a union of a man and a woman, as well as the family, motherhood and parenthood, shall be placed under the protection and care of the Republic of Poland. This means that the view that Polish law as it is today does not allow for the institutionalization of civil partnerships or any other form of legal recognition of families of choice is de facto contrary to the will of the legislator. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I would like to give the floor to Alek, who will present the results of the study as regards identity.
Thank you. I am going to present to you selected aspects concerning identity in the light of the results of quantitative research and the interviews. The respondents were asked about their sexual orientation. As you can see, the respondents proved to be predominantly homosexual, 84%, while 15% defined themselves as bisexual. When gender was added as a criterion for further division, we obtained the following results in our sample. 43% lesbians, 41% gays, 13% bisexual women, 3% bisexual men, and less than 1% heterosexuals of either sex. As you can see, the female respondents in the interviews often do not consider themselves lesbians. Very often they identified as being in relationship with another woman or avoid self-identification, claiming it does not apply to them and limits them in a pointless manner. This fact may be explained by their more fluid female lesbian identity from hetero to homosexual. However, majority of the male respondents didn't problematize their identity. They simply say, "I'm gay." Both in the quantitative research and in the interviews, the respondents presented positive assessment of their sex life. However, as it is visible in the interviews, sexuality is not a key aspect of their identity. Sense of closeness and safety offered by a relationship are more important. For approximately 78% of the respondents in the quantitative study, a successful relationship is necessary for a happy life. Also, the interviews indicated that their relationship with the partner is for the respondents a basic indicator of their identity, and it is one of the most important values in life. In the interviews, we find a small homely sense of community in relation to that, and not the belonging to the wider LGBT community. The respondents stress the normality, the ordinariness of their relationships. Also, the lives of those who live in the big cities are concentrated on their homes, their relations with partners, rather than on the LGBT community. They distance themselves from the community, sometimes feeling different, much more normal, ordinary, than the imaginary standard LGBT person from media representation. This situation differs from the Halberstam's concept of metronormativity and may be connected with a different cultural context, and the sense that this way they protect themselves from the threat of homophobia present in Poland. It is worth mentioning that in the case of interviews with people from the working class, satisfying their basic living needs and lack of possibility of satisfying such needs, it's much more bigger problem than their non-normative sexual identity, even though they encounter homophobia and discrimination. Fears connected with debt, slow pay, and uncertain future dominate as the basic identity factor in their life stories. We can find in the biographical interviews many examples of suffering, surviving, and surpassing stories, as stated by Ken Plummer, elements of experiencing the Schutz trajectory of suffering, in which the respondents went in their lives from suffering connected with hiding their homosexual orientation and entering, regardless of this orientation, in heterosexual marriages. Next, they try to survive in such situations, paying the costs such as depression up to their ultimate liberation from the marriage via divorce and entering the desired current homosexual relationship which gives them happiness and satisfies their needs. I would like to finish by summing up the most important issues connected with the identity of our respondents. Women in the interviews do not define themselves as lesbians, but rather through a relationship with a woman. However, men define themselves as gay, they treat the matter as obvious. In the working class, the economic precariousness is the basic indicator identity factor, not the non-normative sexuality. The key identity element of the respondents in the feeling of closeness is the feeling of closeness and the safety they gain from the relationship, regardless of their location. For the respondents, their home and their relation with the partner are the focal points of their lives instead of the LGBT community. The sense of community applies to the couple only. It may guarantee protection from homophobia. And now Agata, about intimacies.
I believe that as we all sit here, we know the concept of pure relationship and confluent love by Anthony Giddens. This concept has been widely criticized by queer and feminist scholars for several reasons, especially by those who do research on non-heterosexual intimacies. As Neil Gross proved, non-heterosexual relationships are not reluctant to accept the ideal of romantic love. Then Jameson points out that the obsessive individualism is a luxury that not everyone can afford, an example considering class, gender, or ethnic background. Many researchers who deal with intimacy in the field admit that this concept is useful, but only as a point of departure for further research, and that it is a big mistake to use the public concept to describe private lives. For these and many other reasons, I decided to refer concepts used mostly by researchers and not theorists, such as concepts of intimacy as friendship, which goes in accord with understanding of responsibility by Zygmunt Bauman, and then Jameson's concept of disclosing intimacy. Using the concept of radical ordinariness, I tried to counter the radical queer antisocial turn and see how the ordinary intimacies may be radical in practice. Since the vast majority of the research findings states that most of the individual differences in the field of intimacy are connected to gender identity, I decided to treat the gender as a main factor in analyzing data. In the quantitative survey, we asked the respondents to answer a number of detailed questions concerning their feeling of satisfaction with their current relationship. The overwhelming majority of respondents were satisfied with the relationship. Women were a little more satisfied than men. In their interviews, the respondents told us more about their ways of displaying affection. For both sexes, the physical closeness of the partner and their touch in everyday interactions is very important. Men seem to emphasize such forms of display of emotions which are obvious for women and, in my opinion, connected with the social cultural construction of femininity. They stress the fact that they speak fondly to each other and that they really care about their partners. They also justify the need for the contact with a partner during a period of absence and indicate problems with displaying affection associated with gender socialization. They claim that their inherited patterns of displaying or rather non-displaying affection from their parents living in heteronormative relations. An interesting difference also appeared in the area of symbolic forms of displaying affection. Men who have mentioned this, an example Kamil, who talked about the exchange of rings, or Michal, who told a story about wedding vows he exchanged with the partner, focused more on the romance and the symbolic importance of this act, whereas women describe these acts as spontaneous and more ordinary, like Nora, who mentions that her partner proposed while she was doing the dishes. In the quantitative survey, we asked also about the sex life. It was very important for 30% of our respondents and rather important for another 48%. Only 7% of the respondents considered sex as not too important or unimportant in their lives. The comparison shows that, generally speaking, it was a little bit more important for women than for men. This difference between men and women was visible also in the interviews. For women, sex was strongly tied to love, and over the time, what matters more in sex is the deep, intimate connection rather than frequency. It's very much stressed by Kasia, who underlines this, that sex is completely different when you're in love with someone, and how she feels that sad when they don't have sex for some reason. Whereas for men, sex is more connected to fun and play. They very often depreciated the value of sex in their relationships. Over time, they opened their relationship to other sexual contact. In example, you can see Gustav's narrative, who emphasized that it's not the relationship, that he's not in the relationship to have sex, but to be together with his partner. In the survey, we also asked how the respondents define the model of relationship as far as exclusivity in sexual relations was concerned. The vast majority of female relationships were monogamous. In the case of men, it was little more than 2 out of 3 relationships. The remaining group had sex with other people, either with the partner approval or without it, or indicated sex with another person in partners present, meaning threesome, as a separate form. This category was mostly only selected by men. In practice, all female interviewees are monogamous, although it doesn't mean that their monogamy is faultless. Many couples discussed this issue, some opted for temporary opening of the relationship, however, monogamy remains the dominating choice. In the case of men, it's not only so that men are non-monogamous, but also the ways of approaching non-monogamy differ on mostly like individual level, showing the richness and variety of possible applied models. In example, Gustav and Pablo consider their relationship as very strong, and they do not allow others form of emotional bond with them. However, they enter sexual relationships with others as they consider such relations as unconsequential fun. In turn, Sławomir represents the group of relationships which are completely open as far as sex is concerned. Jealousy, which is much stronger and dominates more in the relationship of women than among men, may be both a consequence and cause of the choice of monogamy. In my research on the subject of intimacy, I also tried to confront the concept of fusion. Although it's very hard for me to state that women in same-sex relationships live in fusion, as it would imply that the level of intimacy between them is above average, taking as a standard the pattern of heteronormative relationship. Nonetheless, it's worth noticing that fusion or a specific closeness looks differently for men and women. In the case of men, where one would expect more stress and autonomy, a greater attention was paid to active attempts to maintain closeness between the partners, with the use of conscious strategies and audacious gestures. Among women, however, the closeness was built rather by a constant physical closeness, touch, and great openness and communication. What is also worth noticing is the fact that the majority of the statement, which could serve as the example of fusion in relationships, were found in the interviews with migrants who left Poland and lived permanently in Great Britain. None of the Poland-based respondents spoke of equal force in the subjects. However, it may not be merely coincidental. Social homophobia in Poland may greatly influence the shaping of fusion in relationships bound by the "you and me against the world" strategy, but emigration as a trajectory experience, a major and complex challenge which the couple takes up together, proves a stronger factor resulting in a fusion in relationship. And to sum up, the non-heterosexual people we have spoken with are in a close relationship with their partners, who are for them the greatest and sometimes the only source of support. In my opinion, they put in practice what Lyndon Jameson called disclosing intimacy, and for many of them, the basis of their intimacy is through friendship. Friendship which is based on care, responsibility, trust, open communication, and respect. All these values were mentioned in interviews with our respondents in various moments of the narration. Furthermore, I believe that the model of intimacy as friendship is connected to the status of these relationships which are discriminated in Poland. Such a situation must influence the shaping of intimate life, which corresponds with the idea of scholars connected with the concept of intimate citizenship. In my opinion, in such a social context, it's not possible to build intimate relationship which would be based on the rules of pure relationships by Anthony Giddens. Pure relationships get dirty in the local context. Non-heterosexual person stands to lose a lot when their relationship ends or enters a difficult stage. Their relations find no support from the outside world. Consequently, it seems obvious that such a situation demands more involvement in the relation and taking responsibility for the partner. Consequently, such issues as open communication, emotional closeness, stressing the fact that the relationship requires effort are even more important. In turn, lack of institutional support enforces the creation of individual alternative methods of legitimization of the affection, which is the cause of importance of minor gestures, everyday tenderness, constant contact with the partner. Building intimacy on friendship is not only a way towards their happiness, but also a survival strategy. In my opinion, it demonstrates the burning need for a constant redefinition of the contemporary understanding of intimacy, dominated by great theories and distance from the factors connected with social cultural context or social position. In turn, I would suggest a more holistic, reflected and deepened way of analyzing contemporary changes of intimacy, and this I have tried to do as part of the study. Yeah, now back to you.
Okay. I hope that you managed to listen to me for like 15 minutes, more or less. Okay, so next slide. Next.
Yeah.
The sphere analyzed in my report, I did two. I also analyzed parenthood, but the one I present today, concern relations of families of choice with their families of origin. The ways in which non-heterosexual people display their families and relationships, how they define them in relations to the more or less important others, as similar, ordinary, or different, and what reception, recognition of their own familiarness they encounter are an important element of these relations. The majority of our interviewees exhibited the attitude of rather open, inclusive, and dynamic defining of family, including in their own definitions, first of all, their partners, children, if any, friends, quite often animals, which confirmed the findings of our quantitative survey. If families of origin were included in these definitions, it was rather by force of habit, as a result of the internalized ideology of familiarness, social convictions concerning what family is, should be. The respondents felt that they should include their families of origin as family, although they often sense that they do not fulfill the role typically expected from the family. So, on the level of idea, the respondents included them in the family. On the practical level, however, referring to the values they consider as important for themselves, which build and bind their family, such as support, help, unconditional acceptance, trust, dependence on someone who will not let you down, safety, love. The interviewers feel that these values and practices do not come from their family of origin, parents, siblings, but from their partners or friends. As one of our interviewees, Alena, called it, they are the supportive system, a network of support on which non-heterosexual people can always count while their family of origin often lets them down. So, it is also important that the experience of lack of acceptance on the part of family of origin influences the fact that families of origin are included in the definition less and less often. At the same time, the boundaries of familiarness are broadened by the inclusion of significant others, such as friends who are like the family, as Adam calls them. As a result, we dealt with a particular narrowing of the definition in relation to the traditional one and the idealized model, which does not fit the experiences of families of choice. The issue of distancing oneself from the traditional family and criticism addressed towards it has attracted a special attention in the self-definition as family. Analysis of the semantic field of the concept of traditional family was dominated by the stress put on its excluding normative function. In the opinion of our interviewees, traditional family equals stagnation, exclusion, compulsion, heteronorm. Its false aspiration to being the only model were also noticed. Consequently, the interviewees built their relationships, defined their families in opposition to the traditional one, stressing the difference in relation to this normative model. It is important in the context of approaching the issue within the paradigm of difference, subversion versus similarity, assimilation, and we discussed this morning. So, on the one hand, the interviewers stress the difference. On the other one, they often stress the normality or ordinariness of their own families. In other words, they present themselves as different and similar, sticking to the norm depending on the context and the audience. The value of analyzing family practices within this dichotomy is consequently questioned by them. As it turns out, the dichotomy does not fit actual behavior, or, in other words, the experience does not fit theory. The same interviewees might stress the difference as well as the similarity, depending on the awareness of what purposes they may serve. In case of the difference, they stress that the normative idea of the traditional family limits them. They feel excluded and do not want to emulate it in their own lives. Pointing out to the similarities may be treated strategically as a weapon in the fight for recognition of their own relations. When we look more closely at the meanings applied to normality, they are dominated by the wish for equal treatment. Consequently, the elements of one's own relations, which run counter to social stereotypes of same-sex relationships, are stressed. One might state that the interviewees feel different, but at the same time similar. Or they may even believe that they are different, but still they deserve the same fair treatment. And they believe that the difference should not equal lack of social and legal recognition. Depending on the context, they stress specific elements which form the whole of the relationships. Stressing similarities is like building bridges with the heteronormative majority. Stressing difference is a positive differentiation from the normalizing ideas that which enforces conformist behavior. In both cases, the aim is to underline the value of one's own relations. Consequently, what seems self-contradictory is fully justified. It is also consistent with the fact that defining themselves as family is motivated politically by the will to change something in their social mentality which deprives same-sex couples the right to call themselves families by means of language. Defining oneself as a family serves as an introduction of subversive content, a change of meaning from the inside. Our interviewees are aware of it, as it can be seen from the declared motives of participation in the whole research. They know that they offer a testimony. They demonstrate with their own example the familiarness of the everyday practices, their behavior and language. They are also aware of the fact that saying, "we are a family," repeating the sentence, demonstrating their own practices of familiarness, may work as a performative, bring something into the social life, create reality, as Gustav says, and make the society gradually recognize them as a family. Relations with the family of origin are accompanied by a kind of fracture marked with a sense of disappointment caused by the rejection or lack of recognition from one's own family, its value, as well as by constant attempts to win the unconditional acceptance. The relations often become painful. They are marked with abuse and sense of being discriminated against. The religiosity and the location of the family of origin influence these relations, especially in the beginning when they first learn about the same-sex relationships. In our sample, the most religious families of origin, and this from the lower social classes, had the biggest problems coming to terms with the non-heterosexuality of their children. Their members often resorted to verbal abuse and physical violence, which in their opinion had a reparative function. Reaction of the family of origin to the coming out of the relationship deserves special attention, as it shows with a particular clarity the failure to meet the expectation of non-heterosexual people on the part of their family. One should point out here that they do not expect their family of origin to accept the fact immediately. They are patient, they give their relatives time. In the meanwhile, they try to demonstrate the value of their relations. Furthermore, it should be stressed that changes for the better in relationships with families of origin are initiated by the constant effort of the non-heterosexual persons who fight for recognition with all available means. So they educate their families, suffer the abuse patiently, explain their choices, etc. The number of examples of complete acceptance in our sample was rather small, and it most often included families which took years to work on the issue. Often the acceptance of the current relationship came after the lack of such acceptance for earlier ones. Much more often, we encounter something that one of our interviewees, Sławomir, called a moderate acceptance, a conditional acceptance, limited to a specific space, usually the private one, an acceptance which does not cross the threshold of the family home. It is connected with the phenomenon of the so-called transparent closet, concerning situation in which, after informing the family of origin parents about one's own homosexuality, or in the given case same-sex relationships, the family of origin does not accept the fact, passes over it, but also demands that it should not be revealed to more distant relatives, for instance. It shows the social character of disclosure, the effects of which greatly transcend the private sphere. This lack of acceptance of the knowledge by the family of origin, pretending that nothing has happened, like in the example you can see, influenced the functioning of the now disclosed couple, which expects openness and the connected recognition. The fact that their parents, family of origin, go into or live in the closet forces their children and their partners to live in the closet as well. Families of choice often care very much about being recognized as a family by their family of origin parents. In my analysis, I specified certain particular circumstances which may facilitate, enable this recognition. It is worth noticing that many of these circumstances, like living together, wedding, planning a child, are connected with the functioning of the same-sex couples outside the heteronormative trajectory and lack of socially recognized turning points for the relationships connected with affirmative social rituals. As the moments listed above belong to the life pattern familiar to the older generation, they work as a bridge for the recognition of the relationships. Consequently, building a house together, having a child or marriage, even if it's not legally binding as in Polish case, become for the family of origin signs of the involvement in the relationship, prove its values in their eyes. There are elements of the rite of passage through which a relationship becomes a family in the eyes of the family of origin. I should also point out here again that the willingness to get married, which at the first glance may seem as an assimilation strategy, is often quite far from it. Couples invent their own scenarios, refusing to adapt to the available ones. They do not want to copy it, and if they do, it is also because certain models are necessary not so much for themselves, but for their family of origin. In other words, they need them because these well-known scripts enable them reaching the older generation and help them gain their symbolic recognition and acceptance, for which they care the most. Another moment when the recognition may take place is participation in family celebration of various types. Here you could see the results from our quantitative part, where more than half of the respondents declared not being invited by their families with their partners to celebrate religious holidays and other familiar events such as weddings, funerals. The very fact of being invited together by the family of origin is also very significant for our interviewees. Consequently, they try very hard to convince their parents to invite their partners over for holidays. It is also very painful for them if the parents do not do it. Often, in case of such participation, we deal with recognition through family practices. It often takes place in certain concealment. Certain matters are not fully expressed. For instance, one of our interviewees' partners supported his partner's mother during her husband's funeral, and yet he participated in the celebration anonymously. The distant relatives were at loss of who he was. So in certain cases, the inclusion in the family takes place without naming, through the very participation. And it is sometimes the only available possibility of being with the family and the partner in personally significant moments. One should also stress the contextuality of various naming strategies, both on the side of the families of origin and the families of choice. In the case of the latter, the reluctance towards a relationship is mirrored in the language they use in reference to their son's daughter's partner. Specific forms of address may either create distance or closeness. They can alter in time and place. Like in the quoted case, we can see the transition from calling the daughter's partner that one or the bitch to calling her the second daughter. Actually, it's my favorite quotation of all interviews. The final part of my analysis deals with the support received by family of choice from others, especially from their families of origin. The conclusion of this part is hardly optimistic. When asked on whose support they could count, the interviewees mention first of all their partners. As far as support from the family of origin is concerned, it is usually rather limited to irregular financial assistance, a conclusion which supports the findings of the quantitative study, which you can see at the chart. One should differentiate here the level of declaration on which the interviewees mention their parents as persons on whom they can theoretically count, from the reality, stories of specific situations, which they told us about, in which they didn't actually receive any help at all, or the assistance received didn't match their needs. It is also crucial that the interviewees are aware of the fact that they often cannot count on their parents' support in matters connected with the relationship itself and problems within the relationship. For many of them, it is a proof that the acceptance is often superficial and the parents secretly hope that the relationship would end and their children return to normality. Consequently, one can speak here of particular allotment of support. It takes place on certain conditions established by the parents, which our respondents must accept on when they need assistance or have to seek it elsewhere, for example, among friends. Thus, friends fulfill the role of family. They are like family, a conclusion which supports the tendency noticed earlier in Western literature on the subject. One should point out here that family of origin is not monolithic, but it may have various structures. It may include more or less accepting others, siblings, grandparents, cousins. They often ally themselves with our interviewees in their fight for recognition or provide assistance when the respondents need it the most. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to certain consequences of the lack of recognition of families of choice, both on the part of families of origin, as well as the law and the society, which emerge from our analysis. As they cannot find support from their families of origin, they lack institutional support. They face everyday lack of recognition, fear for their own future or that of their children. Same-sex couples opt for migration and seeking recognition elsewhere. All the interviewees who took this step stressed the difference between the Western and Polish standards, the importance of recognition of their own family, thanks to which they finally felt safe and with dignity. And I would like to finish by quoting one of them who started to feel like a rightful citizen abroad. Thank you. You can take your coffee, ask questions.
If you have any.
Or go forward. Yeah. Sally? Yeah.
Hi, thank you, that was amazing. I've got loads and loads of questions, but I'll ask one for now. And it's a question on identity. So you were kind of saying, I think, that men were more likely to identify as gay than women were as lesbians. How would you analyse that or make sense of that? Is that to do with political identity, political kind of involvement or belonging? Or how would you make sense of that?
Are we collecting or?
Yeah, I think that we will collect. Alek, could you write it down because we...
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's a very, very impressive study. I think we all feel a little bit like you are insane.
We also feel so.
Yeah. And just like Sally, I've got loads of things I want to ask you, but I've got a couple of things for now, which is the role of asexuality in your study, because I noticed that for 4% of people, they said sex, in one of the studies, sex was not important at all. So I was wondering whether you have considered it in your analysis or will. And also to do with, I suppose, class issues, because one of the studies in the evaluation, you asked for people to evaluate based on the online survey, was it? So I'm wondering whether, so everyone had access to internet and computer, and they were able to do it. So I'm wondering whether other participants in lineage, how would they be able to be part of the research in a way?
I'm curious of all of these findings of this massive study, which ones do you think most speak to the specificity of Poland?
Folklore. Yeah, are we answering?
Yeah, maybe those three, and then we'll continue. Okay, so I could just say about the last one. I think all of them somehow. But for instance, personally, when I did this analysis of relations with families of origin and self-definition, right? Actually, I was surprised by when I emerged into the data about this violence on the side of families of origin. Violence, abuse, hostile response. It's like, you know, I just presented you a kind of subtle quotation that I had more, much stronger. And I think that, and interestingly enough, our respondents also didn't mention so much being discriminated against in the outer world. So the discrimination mostly happens in their own families, which is a terrific finding, I guess. It's very sad finding. So outside they can be careful. They could, you know, develop many strategies. They also, you know, somehow can try to I don't know, develop strategies to be somehow recognized. For instance, like, you know, having the same name, they change their names, or they go abroad to get married. Because apparently some people in Poland that don't know that we don't have legal recognition of same-sex partnership, and they think, oh, you're married, okay, so I didn't know, but it's fine. Yeah? But the fact that they are discriminated against, they are not recognized by their own families, it's very painful for them, and personally it was for me when I discovered this. But I don't know, you can answer this question, because I do think that there are many different issues in your own areas of the research.
It's hard to choose. It's hard to choose any. Yeah, I have to think more about this, but I will comment on the other questions. Yours was easy, Christina. So about the evaluation, that was the 21 families that took part in the ethnographic study, and they all were connected to internet, basically because the ethnographer had the option to you know, just be online with the journal. So they were connected to internet. They also, before, you know, participated in the survey that was based mostly in internet, not only, but still.
No, we had posters.
Yeah, we had posters with, you know, paper version before,
Yeah.
but at this particular study, it was basically people who have internet. So all of the 21 families just could easily do it, and it was anonymous, so they feel like they can tell us anything they have in their
If I
hearts.
may just add, it's also important that I do think that it's nowadays we shouldn't think about class issue in connection of not being connected to the internet or not having mobile phones.
That's true.
So it's this kind of different precariousness of families. We had like the working class family. Joanna was doing her ethnography. It was working class family, but
they're
of course,
constantly on Facebook.
Yeah, they're constantly on Facebook. So of course it was probably we didn't reach all Polish, you know, same-sex couples. And maybe some of them are really, but also when you look at the quantitative part, it is also important and that we don't know about how many of non-heterosexual people do not use internet, because internet is the main source of being together nowadays. So even in small cities, you just needed it. It's so important to
not to be the only gay in the village.
Yes, not being the only gay in the village. So I guess it's different sort of being in the I don't know, precarious situation than just not having internet.
Yeah, about the sexuality questions. As asexuality, there, as far as I remember, there was one couple as the interviewees from the interviews that was asexual, like from their kind of declaration. But I think that it's not important for them, but it's hard to analyze it straightly as asexuality, because for men sometimes they when we asked in the interview, tell me about your sexual life, because that was one of the questions that wasn't really fulfilled with the narration for sometimes, most of the time. So when we asked it, most of the men just said, "Oh, it's not so important, So that was like the first line of their narration about it. And I think that they have, it's not only because they're maybe asexual, but maybe super sexual, like really active in the field. But maybe it's also some political statement also, because I think that men feel the need just to emphasize that, I'm not only for sex, I'm just for being close, intimate, and in many different ways. So, and getting to the questions about sexual identity, I guess that for women it's more complicated. First, because it is, like, I think we know from the research and also from feminist theories that it's kind of more complicated, and lesbian continuum and stuff. But also it's more complicated because of the past, because most women that we interviewed had hetero past relationships that were quite long. So, and sometimes this relationship with a woman is the first one with a woman. So they're, somewhere in the middle of defining themselves at these different points of the continuum. So, yeah, and so I think it's all fluid for women for many reasons that we can all analyze together, basically. But, yeah, that's what.
So basically, in the literature, and Alek tried to show it, it's like there are a lot of publications that discuss this fluidity in identity construction. But I think that what is important is to define, and actually Alek also showed this, to define oneself through the relation. Also in men's case as well, So not excluding a bit, or I don't know, putting aside the sexual component because of different reasons. But and also what is quite interesting to somehow being against the outer world. So this is the dyad that we deal with instead of, I don't know, maybe threesomes or different configurations, which might be there, but they are not somehow underlined. Alek, would you like to add something?
And what was interesting, the gays, the men, always said that they always felt homosexual, or always felt gay, even in heterosexual marriages, which is, the statement of the identity, maybe something like that, and it's hard to say why, but it was like a statement. I'm gay, yes, and I always felt like this. Yeah.
Were there more men activists than women, or was that balanced, or how many of your participants were activists?
Activists?
No, there were some, yes.
Few, but not a lot.
But what's also, maybe it's interesting, and Alek also showed this, that we deal with the phenomenon of somehow constructing this dyad as being the only one, normal, ordinary, and the rest is this imaginary LGBT community, which is different. We are different from them, which is quite interesting, and I think it needs further analysis.
That's kind of maybe, I don't know, questions.
Yes.
Okay, so let's do like this side and then you, okay? I don't see it.
Okay, so thank you for your
So Michał and then Brian, okay?
great presentation. I would like to ask you for contextualizing your preliminary results in the context of human geography. So perhaps if you could remark upon whether you found some results that would corroborate the classical urban-rural divide, or whether you support it, or whether you rather query it, or if you could say something to this traditional issue.
Brian?
Yeah, so I was really interested in the point that you had sort of raised in your section of the presentation, Agata, about thinking about the relationship between what you're doing, what this presentation is sort of attempting to do, and some of the theoretical claims, particularly about negativity and antisocial critique. And I was interested in sort of how you all see this study kind of fitting in what's a growing divide regarding the question of public versus private, particularly the critique that often the emphasis on marriage is sort of a retreat into the private. I think that there are ways in which what you all are doing is very much about publicness and public sexuality, and I'm sort of curious how your interlocutors and the families that you've worked with are sort of navigating this distinction between private versus public where their relationships are concerned.
Maybe if I can just add to this, because a related sub-question of mine that I didn't ask was whether you have something to say to the division between the public and private, which in the post-socialist context might be quite different from the Western one. So just to add.
One question, like, first of all, this was amazing, like, congratulations and all that. My question is about the ethnography bit. I was extremely sort of surprised about the extent that you sort of went into the families, and I think I would not know that in Finland anybody would have done anything similar. I know that in Finland my colleagues have done research in families by taping some situations, like for example the kitchen table or the couch on the living room, and they have been analyzing the tapes then later on, but that they would have been on site for so long. Is that something that is sort of common to do in Poland? Is there like a tradition of doing it? No, I mean, I seriously, like, is this something that there is a tradition of doing that type of research, or is it something that you invented for the purpose of this study? And if so, what were the reactions from like research world or from your universities in terms of like ethical questions or having permissions to do that, or where you just did whatever you wanted and got away with it?
Are we collecting more?
Yes, and I think yes. Could you just say your name again?
Yuval. You said that some of the families wanted to participate as activism, and I was wondering if it's had the research has had any like influence the discourse in Poland. Has it been has it got to the media? Has there been any discussion about it? Has it made any impact?
And Justina was first, and that would be probably 2 questions more, and we need to finish Justina short.
Yes, I just want to say I found it absolutely amazing, these results about the family, when you refer to the fact that this is exactly the central position of conflict and oppression, the closest family. And because of my fieldwork in Poland over the last couple of years, I actually realize now, while listening to your findings, that it is the same kind of thing is happening within the heterosexual, so-called heterosexual context of broken families or families where there is some type of abuse. And now I wonder if you could expand this finding a little bit more in the context of how do you see this oppression in terms of cracking hegemony of heterosexuality in Poland.
And the last question.
Yeah.
Could you just say your name?
I'm Marcel.
Marcel.
Yeah. Well, I just want to know something more about the differences between the families in great cities and small towns. There are differences between these families regarding to the strategies to coming out to their families, for an example. And what is the difference? What are the differences? Because in my research, I'm thinking a lot about the difference between the possibility of coming out of gay and lesbian people in small towns and in the huge urban centers. So what is the differences between these kind of spaces and urban centers?
Thank you. And now we have like less than 10 minutes to
I always talk shortly, so I can just...
Okay, just start.
We don't do those kind of ethnographies very often. I guess it's we don't know any similar study.
So it's our design, basically.
It's our utopian idea that somehow we managed to do in this extensive thing. But the only studies we know from the field of queer families is the Carrington Study that probably some of you read. But it was on a much lower level, and I think that the political agenda of the families was crucial for their participating in this research, and we were actually surprised that there are so many people that want to do it, and we didn't even write to the whole 3,000 people. We just wrote to some groups, and then we saw like, oh my God, they're really responding to that. And we had like, the funny thing also about gender division here was that we had 2 lesbian couples per 1 spot. So we had to choose one of 2. And we had like only as much men as we did. So
10 male families and,
but I think it's connected with our whole impression about this research that people, like non-heterosexual people in Poland, basically really want to tell their stories. Yes. That's it. I'll just put a point to it because that's the essence of what we can say on that.
Yeah. And actually it is connected with another question from you about activism, because they really treated this like being in this study as a form of activism, as I don't know, through their own body to tell their stories, to testify, and it was visible throughout all stages, basically. And Agata was saying about this kind of feeling empowerment, but it was, taking part in our research was for them to say something, to do something, to be more active. And what is also interesting that they are not very satisfied with the way LGBT organizations represent them, and they were very critical. So throughout their own stories, they wanted to make a change. They wanted to make a statement. As far as the division, metropolis, villages, big cities, small towns, it's hard to say if small towns and villages are more homophobic. Because we had examples, for instance, the one Alec I think did those interviews of gay couples living in a small city, completely open, with very good relationships with neighbors, with families of origin. So this depends on so many factors that we cannot just say, okay, small cities are homophobic. Mostly they are, but there are really, beautiful examples of acceptance from the families of origin who are from lower class, from small cities, even from religious families. And we have very, homophobic families of origin who are, high class, but very traditional one. In living in big cities. So there is no simple answer to this questions. And I think that it's easier to come out in big cities for different reasons, of course. But as I say, the response from families and also neighbors, we cannot say what influence exactly openness and warm welcoming response. Private-public division. Oh, this is tough one. I think that also what we could see from our different stages is that the private sphere, the house, is very important. So the value of the house, of building together the household, was very important. That was the only safe space, basically. Whereas in public, people try not to be too much open, or they just navigate throughout the space very carefully. So that's what I said, that we really don't have too many examples, both from IBI's part and ethnographic study, of real discrimination in the outer world, because they just they are invisible, basically, or sometimes they are very carefully chosen circles of friends and I don't know others who could whom they can trust, and they also think that they could be themselves in the private sphere. So private is very important, and this division, private-public, is also important for this reason, for political simply reason. It's a kind of strategy. So yeah, I don't know if it answers your
I
questions.
think the important you ask about the ethical dimension. I think that we somehow got under the radar, basically, because social research in Poland it's not so controlled. You don't have to, have this ethical committee and stuff. Not always, basically. In this research, we didn't have to do anything, and the ethical protocol that I mentioned, we did only for ourselves. We just sat and wrote it for ourselves. We sent it to the families so they would know also what are our rules, and we all signed them, and ethnographers also signed them. So it was like our, for our core values thing, and so I know it's really a risky and very going really deeply into relationship, but I feel that maybe because of the the friendships between the ethnographers and the families, but it was possible to do it this way, because there were problems in the field, but only like few situations that someone really wanted to quit, but then they didn't, because of the ethnographers. So that's why we could do it. And Yuval, you asked about media. Actually, this is the first time we are presenting about the ethnographic part. So I hope that you go and tell them. We didn't. No, I'm joking. But the media in Poland know about our quantitative study, because we organized a big conference also for the media. So there were a lot of articles about this, because numbers are good to use in a journal. So and living proof of people just existing and having many different ideas of how to live their lives. So. That's what they know about, and qualitative study, as probably you can imagine, it's not so flashy and sexy at the first spot. So basically, we didn't publish so much yet. We are doing it.
Yeah, and
all
also
the time,
I do think that they were interested in this, but because they were looking for controversy. So there was also always the dilemma not to advertise this research so much, to be able to concentrate on doing the research instead of fighting the homophobic response. Because when we published our report in Poland about this quantitative part, And then there was this huge discussion, and the most important issue was numbers, that there are so many, it's impossible. Second, that they are happy, they cannot be happy, it's, it's a fabrication. And third, that that they are satisfied with the relationships. And fourth, I think that they had long relationships, because they cannot have long relationships, for sure, right? So you could see that this kind of response from the media, some of the media, was not what we were looking for, and we tried not to, get into this discussion, because it's, I don't know, below our level, yeah? So we are not going to do so. Okay, so I think we need to end now. Thanks a lot.